Here is the full story, uninterrupted and complete. The village of Darashin sat in a bowl of land between two low ridges where the desert began to argue with the foothills, neither terrain winning, both leaving their mark on everything that grew or lived there. The soil at the edge of the village was a particular color, pale ochre with a reddish undertone, fine, grained and dry, the kind that lifted in the lightest wind and settled on every surface it could find. The older people of the village called it dead sand. The children, who had not yet learned to be careful with their words around her, called it her sand, meaning the sand that surrounded the compound of a woman named Zarina Bibi, who had lived on eastern rim of the village for 31 years and who was, depending on who you asked and when, either a stubborn fool or a cursed woman or simply the kind of person that a small community produces and then doesn't know what to do with. Zarina Bibi was 53 years old. She was thin in the way that sustained physical work makes people thin, not fragile but stripped down to the functional. Her hands roughened to the texture of the clay pots she had been making since she was 8 years old. She had a face that people described differently depending on their feeling about her. Kind people said it was a face that had seen things. Unkind people said it was a face that had refused to give anything up, and both descriptions were accurate in their way. She wore the same style of clothing she had always worn, plain and practical, the colors of the earth around her house, which was to say the colors of things that had been through a great deal and were not making any special claims about it. Her husband had died 18 years ago, leaving her with 2 daughters, a mud brick compound that needed constant repair, and a craft that nobody in the immediate village particularly wanted any more. He had been a potter too, a skilled one, and when he was alive, the two of them had worked the clay together in a partnership so habitual and efficient that it had operated almost without conversation, each understanding what the other needed before it was asked for. After he died, she had kept working, because the work was all she had and the daughters needed to eat, and because stopping felt like a concession she was not prepared to make to grief. The craft was clay work, pottery, mostly, but also tiles and small figurines and the particular kind of sealed water vessels that the hill people used for storing grain against mice and moisture. She dug her clay from a deposit along a dry streambed about 2 kilometers from the village, a deposit that the other potters in the region had long since abandoned in favor of a different clay source to the north that was smoother and more cooperative and required less preparation. Zarina's clay was difficult. It had a high mineral content that made it granular and stubborn, resistant to shaping in ways that could make a less patient person throw it against the wall, which some people literally had. It cracked during drying if you didn't manage it carefully. It required longer firing at higher temperatures than the northern clay. It was, by any practical assessment, more trouble than it was worth. This was the opinion of essentially everyone who had expressed one on the subject. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Gaffur, who ran a small general goods shop from the front room of his house, had told her this in approximately those words at least a dozen times over the years. Not cruelly, Gaffur was not a cruel man, but with the pragmatic directness of someone who considered it friendly to tell a person when they were making an obvious mistake. Switch to the northern clay, he said. Everyone else has. Your pots would be smoother, and your life would be easier, and you could actually sell what you make at the market without people walking past your stall like it isn't there. Because that was also true. Her pots did not sell well at the monthly market in the larger town of Karabad, 2 hours away by the road that wound through the foothills. The other potters sold smooth vessels in the shapes that people wanted, shapes that had become standardized over the years the way popular things become standardized, the rough edges worn off by market preference until what remained was something that everyone found acceptable and nobody found remarkable. Zarina's pots were different. The texture of the clay came through in the finished piece, giving the surface a quality that was almost rough in places, definitely not smooth, and decorated with marks she pressed into the wet clay using tools she'd made herself from wood and bone, patterns that came from somewhere in her that she had never tried to explain. The patterns were not traditional, exactly, or not only traditional, they were something older and stranger, half remembered from her mother's work and half invented, geometric in some parts and organic in others, the kind of thing that either caught a person's eye or didn't, with very little middle ground. At the market in Karabad, they mostly didn't catch eyes, or they caught eyes but not hands. People would stop and look and sometimes pick up a piece and turn it over with a considering expression, and then they would set it back down and buy something smooth and familiar from the next stall. Zarina had stopped trying to interpret these transactions. She sold what she sold, which was enough to maintain the compound and feed herself and occasionally send a small sum to her daughters, both of whom had married and moved to different towns and both of whom worried about her in the particular way that daughters worry about a mother who has decided to conduct her life on her own terms regardless of what the terms suggest. The sand around her compound was part of the story people told about her, though it was a story she had never told herself and would not have recognized as particularly meaningful. The truth of the sand was geological. Her compound sat on a slight elevation where the soil was thin, and the wind came through a gap in the eastern ridge with some regularity, carrying the fine particles from the dry streambed and depositing them around her walls. The sand was not different from sand anywhere else in the region. It was not cursed. It was just there, pale and fine and plentiful, collecting in the corners of her doorways, drifting along the base of her outer wall, getting into the clay she stored under a tarp in the courtyard, if she wasn't vigilant, which sometimes she wasn't. The cursed sand story had started with a woman named Fatima Jan, whose goat had wandered into Zarina's courtyard through a gap in the wall and eaten a quantity of drying clay that had made it ill for 2 days. Fatima Jan had been angry in the way that people are when something belonging to them is hurt, and they need the hurt to have a cause that is external and clear. She had told the story of the sick goat several times in the days following, and in the telling the clay had become the sand, and the sand had become cursed, and the sickness of the goat had become evidence of something that Zarina was doing or was, and by the time the story had circulated through the village's essential network of morning conversations and evening gatherings, it had acquired a life of its own, separate from the goat and from Fatima Jan's specific anger, and from anything Zarina had actually done. Zarina knew about the story. She did not dignify it with a response, which some people in the village interpreted as confirmation and others as the kind of self-possession that was itself a little unsettling. She continued digging her clay and working her wheel and firing her kiln and going to the market in Karabad once a month with a load of pieces wrapped in old cloth, and she continued selling some of them and bringing some back unsold, and the rhythm of her life moved in its accustomed groove while the story about her sand moved in its own groove parallel to it, the two rarely intersecting in any way that materially changed either. This was the situation, stable and unremarkable, in the early spring of the year that everything changed. The change began not with Zarina but with a man named Pervez Akhtar, who ran a small trading operation out of Karabad and who had, over a period of years, built a modest business supplying household goods to villages in a radius of about 50 kilometers. Pervez was in his 40s, methodical and observant, the kind of trader who paid attention to things that other traders dismissed as unimportant because the unimportant things were sometimes where the money was hiding. He had been watching the market at Karabad for 3 years with a particular kind of attention, looking for what people walked past and then came back to, what they touched and didn't buy, what they asked prices for without purchasing. He had noticed Zarina's stall. He had noticed specifically that certain people, not local people, not the regular market, goers from the immediate region, stopped at her stall with a quality of attention different from what they gave to the smooth pots at the adjacent tables. These were people passing through, travelers, merchants from further away, and the way they looked at her pieces was the way someone looks at a thing that reminds them of something they didn't know they were looking for. They picked things up and held them longer. They asked questions, occasionally, that she answered in her brief and unembellished way. Most of them didn't buy, for the same reason most people didn't buy: price uncertainty, the unfamiliarity of the aesthetic, the fact that they hadn't been looking for it when they arrived. But some did buy, a small percentage, and Pervez had the trader's habit of paying attention to the small percentages. He went to see Zarina on a Wednesday morning in March, driving his small truck along the track to the eastern rim of the village, where her compound sat in its perpetual drift of pale sand. She was working the wheel when he came through the gate, which she had left open in the way of someone who neither particularly welcomed visitors nor particularly feared them. She looked up when she heard his truck and did not stop working. He told her who he was, which she already knew because Karabad was not a large town, and Pervez was not an obscure figure in it. He told her he had been watching her work at the market for some time, which she received without visible reaction. Then he said that he had recently been in contact with a buyer in Peshawar who was looking for specific kinds of traditional craft objects, not reproductions of known traditional forms, but things that had genuine regional character, genuine age in their aesthetic, even if they were newly made, things that carried in their physical form the evidence of a particular way of making. Zarina kept the wheel turning while he talked. The clay under her hands was going up into a form she had in mind, a medium vessel with a wide shoulder, and she was not going to stop it for a conversation that might or might not be going somewhere. Pervez put a piece of paper on the low wall beside her, a letter, he said, from the buyer in Peshawar, asking for photographs and quantities and prices. He suggested that if she was interested, he could take photographs of her work and send them, and if the buyer responded positively, the conversation could continue. He was not making promises. He was describing a possibility. She said she would think about it. He drove away, and she sat with the clay and thought about it for approximately 3 days, which was how she thought about things, in the space between her hands and the wheel, in the particular emptiness that good work creates around itself when you're doing it. The thinking was not complicated. Either the thing Pervez described was real and would come to something, or it was not real and would not, and in neither case would thinking about it more intensely change which of those was true. What she decided, at the end of the 3 days, was that she had nothing to lose by allowing photographs to be taken, and so she sent word to Pervez through Gaffur that she was agreeable. Pervez came with a phone camera on a Saturday and spent an hour photographing her pieces, the ones on the drying shelf, the ones already fired and waiting. A few of the older pieces she kept on a shelf in the interior room because they were her favorites, or because some quality in them marked a moment in her development that she didn't want to forget. He photographed them against the wall of the compound, against the pale sand of the ground, in the light of midday and in the softer light of late afternoon. He was careful and thorough, and she watched him work with a neutral attention that he found, he said afterward to his wife, mildly intimidating. He sent the photographs to Peshawar, and then to 2 other contacts he had, one in Lahore, one in a town near the Afghan border that functioned as a crossroads for goods moving in several directions. He sent them without much expectation, the way a careful person diversifies a small investment, because the loss, if it came to nothing, was minimal, and the gain, if any of it led somewhere, was real. The response from Peshawar came in 10 days. It was interested, specifically and technically interested, using language that told Pervez the buyer had some genuine knowledge of craft, asking about the clay body, the firing temperature, whether the decorative marks were freehand or stamped, whether the maker had any documentation of the technique's lineage. Pervez took these questions to Zarina, who answered them with the brevity of someone describing something so obvious to them that the asking seemed almost comical. The clay was from the streambed, always had been. The firing was in her kiln, which she had rebuilt 3 times over the years, and which ran hot because the wood from the hillside ran hot. The marks were her own, developed from her mother's patterns and from 30 years of her own work. She had no documentation. She had her hands and her memory and the evidence of her practice. Pervez sent the answers. 2 weeks later, he received a formal inquiry for a consignment, 20 pieces, specific sizes, an offered price per piece that he read twice before going to find Zarina. She was at the streambed when he found her, digging clay with a short, handled spade, her movements economical and unhurried, a plastic tub on a small handcart beside her. He read her the price. She stood up and looked at him with an expression that he couldn't immediately classify, not surprise exactly, because surprise implied that you had expected something different, and he wasn't sure what she had expected, and then she went back to digging. He asked if she wanted to proceed. She said yes. The first consignment took her 6 weeks to complete, working at the pace she always worked, which was the pace of getting it right rather than getting it done. She did not alter her process for the order. She dug the same clay from the same streambed. She prepared it the way she always prepared it, the long soaking, the careful removal of the coarser inclusions, the mixing to a consistency she knew by feel after decades of knowing it. She threw each piece on the wheel with the attention she gave to all her pieces, the attention that was not romantic or ceremonial, but simply the correct amount required to make something that was actually good. She pressed her marks into the clay when it was leather, hard, using the same tools, the patterns emerging with the naturalness of things that have been done so many times they no longer require decision. She dried them slowly, turning them in the shade to prevent the cracking that the mineral content invited if you let the drying happen unevenly. She fired them in her kiln over 2 days, managing the temperature by reading the color of the flame with the knowledge of 30 years. And what came out was what she had always been making: the same surfaces, the same forms, the same marks, the same quality of presence in the finished object that was either something you saw or something you didn't. She packed them in the cloth she used for the market, wrapped individually, and Pervez came and took them in his truck to ship to Peshawar. The buyer in Peshawar sent payment and asked for more. He also, apparently, showed the pieces to someone, because within 3 weeks of the first consignment's delivery, Pervez received an inquiry from Lahore that was not from the contact he had originally sent photographs to, but from someone that contact had spoken to, a dealer in craft objects who supplied a clientele that Pervez described to Zarina, with some care for accuracy, as people who collected things, serious people, people with the means to pay serious prices. This inquiry asked for a different range, smaller pieces, some of the figurines she occasionally made, anything with the specific decorative marks that had been visible in the photographs. The inquiry from near the Afghan border came 3 days after that, from a trader who dealt across the border in both directions and who had heard about the Peshawar order through the specific and efficient information network that connected traders in this part of the world, a network that moved news about the location and availability of particular goods with a speed that would have surprised anyone who imagined that commercial intelligence required modern infrastructure. 3 inquiries from 3 territories, arriving within a month of the first consignment's delivery. Pervez brought them to Zarina on a Tuesday evening, sitting in the courtyard of her compound with the papers spread on the low table between them, going through each one with the methodical clarity that was his professional manner. She listened to all of it and then sat for a while looking at the compound wall, where the pale sand had drifted as it always did into the corners and along the base, fine and indifferent, doing what wind and dry earth do. She asked Pervez if he could manage the orders. He said he could manage the communication and the shipping if she could manage the production, and that the question was what production she could actually sustain without compromising the work. Because the work was the thing that had created the interest, and compromising it would end the interest. This was the most insightful thing Pervez had said in the conversation, and Zarina looked at him with a slight adjustment of expression that he recognized as the closest thing to approval she was likely to offer. She told him she could make what she could make, that she would not make it faster or differently, and that if the orders required more, then that the orders would have to wait or find something else. He agreed to these terms. Word moved through the village, word always moved through the village, about the orders and the payments and the traders from Peshawar and Lahore and the territory near the border. It moved in the way that information moves in a small community, which is to say that it accumulated detail as it went, some of the detail accurate, and some of it expanded by the natural tendency of a story to grow in the direction of its own most interesting possibilities. By the time the information reached Fatima Jan, the woman of the sick goat and the cursed sand, it had grown to include a number of specifics that were inventions, but the core of it, the orders, the 3 territories, the prices, was real and accurately reported. Fatima Jan came to see Zarina. She came on a Friday morning, walking across the village in the direct and unhurried way of someone who has decided to do something and sees no benefit in delay, and she stood in the gate of Zarina's compound and called out. Zarina was inside, working, and came to the door and looked at her visitor without apparent surprise. The conversation between them was brief. Fatima Jan said that she had heard about the orders, and that she wanted to say something about the sand, about the cursed sand, and whether she had perhaps been hasty in what she had said all those years ago. Zarina listened to this, and then said that the sand was sand, that it was not cursed and never had been, that it blew in from the streambed because of the ridge gap, and deposited where the walls caught it, and that this was what sand did when the conditions were right for it, and that the goat had eaten clay, not sand, and that clay eaten in sufficient quantity would make any animal sick, which was simply a fact about clay, and was not a fact about Zarina or anything Zarina had done. Fatima Jan absorbed this with the expression of someone receiving a correction that they deserve and know they deserve, which is an uncomfortable expression to hold. Then she said that she heard the pots were very fine, and asked if she could see them. Zarina held the door open and let her in. The things Fatima Jan saw in Zarina's workroom were the things that had always been there: the drying shelf with its ordered rows of vessels in various stages of completion, the fired pieces waiting in their wrapped cloth, the tools on the wall in their accustomed places, the wheel standing at the center of the room with the slight damp smell of clay around it that the room always held. The pieces were what they had always been: rough in the specific way of that particular clay, marked in the specific way of Zarina's specific hand, present in the way that things made with genuine and long-sustained attention have a kind of presence. Fatima Jan picked one up, a medium vessel with the wide shoulder, and held it in a way that Zarina recognized, the way people held things when the object was speaking to something in them that they hadn't expected. She set it back down and said nothing of substance, and left, and that was the last time the cursed sand was mentioned in any serious way in the village. Gaffur came next, not to apologize exactly. Gaffur was constitutionally more comfortable giving advice than retracting it, but to say that if there were pieces she didn't send to the orders that she needed to move locally, he would be happy to put them in his shop on a consignment basis, which was a more commercial framing of what was essentially a reversal of his long-standing position. Zarina said she would think about it, which she did, and eventually she did bring him pieces, and some of them sold to people passing through who stopped for water or fuel and found themselves standing in a small general goods shop on the eastern rim of a village they'd never heard of, holding something that they hadn't expected to find there and weren't entirely sure what to do with, and sometimes bought anyway. The daughters called more frequently after the news reached them, their worry transmuted gradually into something more complicated, a mixture of relief and a kind of retrospective guilt, the guilt of people who had urged their mother, gently and from a distance, to make practical adjustments to her life, and who were now confronting the possibility that the lack of practical adjustment had been the point. The older daughter, Nadia, who lived in Rawalpindi and worked as a school administrator, called on a Sunday evening and asked her mother how she had known to keep working with difficult clay, to keep making the things she made, to resist the market logic that said make what people are buying. Zarina thought about this for a moment. The honest answer was that she hadn't known. She had continued because stopping had felt impossible, because the work was what she was, and she had not found a way to be something different, and because the clay from the streambed was the clay she understood, and the patterns she pressed into the wet surface were the patterns that came from her, and she had not found a way to make different patterns without making something that was not hers. Whether this was wisdom or stubbornness or simply the inability to imagine an alternative, she genuinely could not say. She told Nadia that she had not known anything. She had only done what she could do. Nadia was quiet for a moment on the phone and then said that she was coming to visit next month, which she did, and which was the first visit in 2 years, and which resulted in Nadia sitting in workroom for an entire afternoon watching her mother at the wheel with the particular quality of attention you give to something you have underestimated for a long time and are now looking at properly. The orders continued through the spring and into the summer. Pervez was efficient and honest, taking a commission that he had named upfront and not adjusted, managing the communication with the buyers with the professional competence that was his genuine strength. The buyer in Peshawar placed a third order and then a fourth. The Lahore dealer sent a colleague to see the work in person, a woman named Sarah who drove out from Karabad in a rented car and sat with Zarina for 3 hours, asking questions, photographing, handling pieces, asking questions again. She was in the business of connecting makers with buyers, and she had the professional vocabulary of that trade, but also, underneath it, a genuine eye, and Zarina spoke to the eye and not to the vocabulary. Sarah wrote a piece about Zarina's work, not for any major publication, but for a small magazine that circulated among craft collectors and dealers, a publication printed on good paper with photographs that reproduced color and texture with fidelity, and the piece described the clay and the technique and the marks, described the compound at the eastern rim of the village, described the pale sand around the walls in a way that was appreciative and precise, and which Zarina, when Sarah read it to her, found neither accurate nor inaccurate, but simply the way things appeared from outside, which was different from the way they appeared from the inside, but not necessarily wrong. The village, as the months passed, reorganized itself around the new reality of what Zarina was. Not dramatically. Villages don't reorganize dramatically around individual stories. They absorb them gradually, the way the streambed clay absorbed water, the new thing becoming part of the texture of the familiar. She was still the woman with the pale sand around her compound. She was still singular and private, and not particularly inclined toward the social performances of acknowledgement and inclusion that communities run on. But the story told about her changed not all at once, not with any announced revision, but in the way that stories change when the evidence requires it, when the thing being observed becomes different enough from the story being told that the story has to bend or break. It bent. The cursed sand became, in Fatima Jan's own retelling of the old incident, which she did tell several times, with the candor of someone who had decided that accountability was better than pretense, simply a misunderstanding, a story that had gotten ahead of itself, a goat being a goat and clay being clay, and a woman being a woman who worked hard at something difficult and turned out to have been right to keep working at it. On an evening in late August, the second summer of the orders, Zorena sat in her courtyard after a long day at the wheel. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the light coming over the top of it was the particular orange that the dust in the air made of it, and the compound walls threw long shadows across the ground where the pale sand lay as it always lay, fine and indifferent, catching the last of the color. A finished vessel sat on the low wall beside her, drying, one of the pieces for the Lahore order, wide, shouldered, marked with the patterns that were hers and had always been hers, the surface rough with the mineral content of the streambed clay, carrying in its texture and its form 30 years of the same pair of hands working the same way in the same place. She looked at it in the fading light the way she looked at everything she made, which was with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who has done something and wants to know honestly whether it is what it should be. It was. Not perfect, nothing was perfect, and she had stopped wanting perfection somewhere in the middle decades, having understood that the slight asymmetry, the place where the mark pressed deeper on one side, the particular way the surface caught and diffused light were not flaws in the work, but evidence of the work having been done by a specific person, this person, and that this specificity was the thing that made it what it was rather than something else. The sand lay around the base of the wall. The light kept going. Somewhere in Peshawar and Lahore and the territory near the border, the previous consignments sat in rooms she would never see, in the hands of people she would never meet, carrying whatever it was they carried into places she could not imagine. This was fine. She had made them and sent them, and they were what they were. And tomorrow the wheel would be waiting, and the clay was in the courtyard under its tarp, and the streambed would yield more when she needed it, as it always had, as it would keep doing, reliable and difficult and entirely hers.